Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I have a handwork project I want to share with you. We are making these knitted pumpkins. This is a great fall activity, and if you're interested in seeing some of our other fall activities and projects, you can check the description box below. I have a complete playlist. For this project, I'm going to be using some bulky weight yarn and some size 10 needles. The first thing I'm going to do is measure out about 2 feet of yarn. And we are going to cast this on to our knitting needles by making a slip knot. And then we're going to slide that onto our knitting needles and gently tighten it, but we still want it pretty loose. Next, we're going to hold those 2 pieces of yarn between our fingers and take our 3 fingers and wrap it around the bottom. We want this nice and snug, so that we can pull from the yarn on our thumb and then to our finger and then gently tug it tight onto our knitting needle. I'm going to show you this a few more times, and each time you tighten it, you don't want it to be too snug. You want the cast on stitches to slide easily on your knitting needle, and you want there to be enough room so that when you begin to knit, it's not too tight. Generally, I'm a little bit more of a tighter knitter than a looser knitter, so you can adjust appropriately depending on which side you tend to veer on. So I'm going to cast on about 14 stitches, and I want it to be about 4 inches. Of course, you can make this any size you want as long as the width is half as long as the length. So it's about 4 inches, and now we can begin knitting. You want to make sure that you're not going to knit your tail. And it is quite a small tail, so eventually I'm going to have to tighten it a little bit. But if it's too long, I've noticed that sometimes we end up knitting that instead. I'm going to slide my knitting needle into my first stitch. I'm going to wrap my yarn around the knitting needle and then pull it right through. Then we're going to take that stitch off, and then we're going to go to the next one and slide that yarn around and then pull it through. And you can see that I've tightened up that tail a little bit because it got a little bit loose. So we're going to do several rows, and so we just want to get to about twice as long as we have width. And so for this bulky yarn, we are doing about 13 to 15 stitches, and then we're just going to continue knitting. You can make this smaller, and you can also make it larger. Okay, so now I'm just going to continue knitting. This was a very short project. It didn't take more than about a day or 2. And this is a project that I'm doing with my 9-year-old daughter and my 14-year-old son. Okay, so now you can see that it's quite long, but it's a little bit misshapen. You can see that towards the top it's a little bit longer than towards the bottom. Overall, it folds in half nicely, and it is 8 inches by 4 inches, so it's time for us to bind off. I'm going to go ahead and knit 1 stitch and then another one. And you have to pay attention if you're not used to binding off, because now we have to slip that first stitch over our second stitch. Sometimes I end up just knitting the whole thing and forgetting that I'm supposed to be binding off. My 9-year-old daughter and my 14-year-old son can do this really easily as well, but if you have a new knitter, you might want to sit with them and watch as they bind off, just so they don't go back to knitting rather than binding off. Okay, so for your last stitch, we're going to go ahead and slip it over so that we just have that 1 stitch left. We're going to trim our yarn so we have a tail of about 6 inches or so. And then we want to carefully remove our knitting needle and slide that extra piece of yarn through that final loop so that we can lock it in place. Okay, so now comes the fun part of turning this 2-dimensional object into a 3-dimensional object, especially one that's round coming from a rectangle. So I've measured out quite a lengthy piece of yarn, and I am using a needle that has a wide eye, but actually not wide enough, and it has a blunt tip, but it's also not blunt enough, and I'm going to tell you some of the issues that we run into by not having the correct needle here. It works, but we did run into a couple of problems. Okay, so I'm going to tuck those two tails into our project. We don't need them anymore. They're just going to become part of the filling. And I'm going to go towards the part that has the casting on and the binding off to sew them together. And it's important that we are sewing it this way because once we're done, we want the ridges of our pumpkin to go up and down. So I'm going to leave a really long tail as I am sewing these two pieces together. Now the reason why you want a blunt needle and one that's actually bigger than this is because you don't want to split your yarn. You want to go between the stitches. And in some cases I'm not, and you're seeing that I have to tug quite a bit to get the needle out, and that's because I'm actually going between the yarn rather than between the stitches. Once we get to the end, we're just going to get right to that corner before we start stitching in a different way. Of course, you want to make sure that you have enough yarn to continue this process. So do take about 2 or 3 feet of yarn. Now we're going to go through about every other stitch, and we're going to just catch that top part of that stitch so that we're just going in between the stitches and not in between the yarn. And we're going to go all the way around the bottom of this, and then we're going to pull it tightly. Now you will have to go around maybe twice. Once you go around the first time, it may be enough and you may not want to tighten it another time, but I went ahead and I did it twice. So this is just the first round where I'm catching every other stitch, and you can see that I kind of ran into a little bit of a knot here, but it's okay. We pulled it right through, and you can see that you can pull it nice and tight, and it's great. It forms the bottom of our pumpkin. But I'm going to go ahead and catch every other stitch that I've already done just so that I have a nice tight bottom. But you actually don't need to do this at the very end of this video. I will show you the ones that my son did, and the ones where he didn't pull it quite as tightly actually look a little bit more authentic to what you'd expect a pumpkin to be. The last thing we're going to do is pull our needle right through the center of our pumpkin, and that's so that we can pull it tightly and kind of give it that shape of our pumpkin. Next, I'm going to use some wool to fill up my pumpkin, and I'm trying just to go around the edges of the pumpkin and trying to keep the yarn and the needle kind of coming right through the center, because we're still going to need that to finish off the top of our pumpkin. And we also want our filling to be around the outside so that we can shape it into that pumpkin shape that isn't quite circular. It's a little bit pulled in at the top and pulled up at the bottom. Now, when you're working with wool, it's going to kind of compact over time. You're going to need to fill it so that it's nice and full, but still manageable to form. And this is just something that you will kind of figure out over time what works well for your projects. And so I have enough where it's still soft, but it's firm enough that it's not going to lose its shape, but soft enough that I can still kind of tuck down the top and pull up the bottom. Okay, so now it's time to work on bringing the top together the same way we did the bottom. And we still have a stem to do. So I took that needle and removed it off the yarn that I had pulled through the bottom. And now I am putting that needle back onto the yarn that was the long tail from the very beginning. You don't need to do this. You could certainly just thread your needle and a new piece of yarn, but I went ahead and did this so that I didn't have to bind, or rather lock my yarn in place every time. So now I'm going to do the same thing to the top as I did to the bottom, and that's to go through every other or every third stitch. And I am now just trying to be really mindful of just getting those stitches and not going through the yarn so that I don't have to tug my needle through. And once again, I'm going to be going around the circle twice, but once I'm done going around it once, I'm going to pause because we still need to make our stem, and I want to sew that in to the top. To make our stem, I'm going to use a knitting tower and some of this Lamb's Pride worsted weight, so it's going to be a little bit thinner. And this knitting tower is going to give us that nice stem. So it has a beginner and a more advanced end to the knitting tower. And I start with the one that has the 4 prongs, but quickly I realized that I should have done the one with 6 prongs. I'm going to start by showing you the one with 4 prongs. The process is the same, but at the very end, you're going to see me taking it off of one that has 6 prongs. So the first thing we're going to do is do a little slip knot. We're going to slip that tail down into the bottom of the knitting tower, and we're going to take that slip knot and we're going to put it around one of those prongs. You're going to need to tug on the bottom part every now and then just to get your project down to the bottom. And we're going to loop our yarn around and then almost like skip to the next prong, but not quite. So this did take a little bit of practice. Once you get it, it's very obvious, but it did take me a little while to recognize that I needed to go kind of overshoot the prong and then come around to the back. And then you take the lower portion of the yarn and slip it over the top portion of the yarn. So for this project, the instructions also come with the knitting tower. It is by Camden Rose. You can find all of the materials that we used on the blog post that accompany this video. Okay, so you can see that I did it quite a bit, and now you can see that it's on the side that has the 6 prongs. The process is the same. Now I've trimmed off about 10 inches, and we want to lock each one of those little loops. So we're going to slip our yarn into that loop to lock it, and you can actually tie it into a knot, but I found that just slipping it in was good enough, but on occasion I did tie it off, but because the bottom is pretty well tied and this part is going to be inside our pumpkin, I just made sure that each of those loops wouldn't come undone. So this is a great knitting project for a young student, both the pumpkin and the knitting tower. You can expect to find these simple projects in grade 1 and 2 in Waldorf schools. Turning a flat rectangle into a sphere is a lot of fun. You can make all kinds of projects with that. So I'm just about ready to finish off the last 2 loops of this knitting tower, or this little knitting project here, and it gives you just the right size for a stem, so you can use it for all kinds of projects. And now I'm going to slip that lower end into our pumpkin, and then while I stitch around the pumpkin a second time, I'm going to make sure to also go into the stem now and then, just so that it is nice and snug and locked in place. So now it's time to go through maybe every 3rd stitch, and they're a little bit harder to find now because it's the second time around and you're pulling it nice and snug, and it kind of brings all of those pieces together. And you can see that I'm going through the stem now and then. This will be locked in place nice and snug. It's going to be a wonderful decoration and even a plaything for the children if they like. And I found that they are pretty sturdy, and so you can rest assured that your children will have many hours of play, imaginative play if they wish, or it makes a really lovely decoration for a nature table or for a fall spread. Okay, so now that that part is done, I'm going to take that long tail which came from the bottom of the pumpkin. I want to pull it nice and snug because I want the bottom of the pumpkin to come up just a little bit to give it that quintessential pumpkin shape. And then with the yarn that I just used in order to stitch the top part of the pumpkin together, I'm going to tie them together. And while tying it, I'm going to pull on that bottom yarn just a little bit more. That's what I'm doing right now, just to make sure that it kind of pulls up from the bottom. Now you can shape this quite a bit once it's done. You can see that it really does look like a pumpkin. And once you're done knotting it, we're going to weave that piece of yarn back into your project so that we're not just trimming it off right at the knot. Otherwise, it's likely to come undone. So we've just weaved it through the project and then just trimmed off that excess piece. And that just falls into the center of your pumpkin. It just becomes some of the stuffing. And I'm going to do the same thing with the other piece. Just going to kind of get it into the inside of the pumpkin, pull it snug, trim it carefully, and then it just kind of falls back inside and just kind of gets tugged back inside. And then of course the last thing we want to do is do the same thing to the yarn from our stem. And the knitting tower makes a very loose knit, so we're just going to go right down into the center of that stem, pull it snug, and then do the same thing, trim it off, and then that little tail just disappears right inside the project. And that's it. And you can see how the ridges of the pumpkin go up and down the way you would typically see for a pumpkin. So make sure that when you're making your project, it is twice as long as it is wide, and then you will achieve this pumpkin look. I want to show you the two pumpkins that my son did. Once he makes one, it's so quick to make another one. And you can see for this one that there was a little bit more open on the bottom, and it actually sits a little bit better and looks a little bit more like a pumpkin versus the first one that he did where it was snug all the way through. These are really wonderful projects that will look really great on a nature table. They're fantastic beginner projects for grade 1, 2, and 3. Here's a little look at our nature table. And don't forget, if you want to see some of our other fall projects, you can check the description box below. That link will take you to a complete playlist for all of our fun fall projects. And don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more tutorials and information on the products that we used. And if you want to see how our homeschool is progressing on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram at Pepper and Pine.